The letter came on a Tuesday. Not a Monday, Mondays already carry enough weight. Not a Friday, when bad news at least has the weekend as a buffer. A Tuesday. The most unremarkable day of the week. Which somehow made it worse. Crisp envelope. Official HOA letterhead. The kind of language inside that's been reviewed by an attorney before it ever reached your mailbox. Precise, measured, and designed to leave you no comfortable interpretation. It said my in-ground pool was non-compliant, unpermitted, built without the required HOA Architectural Committee approval. And it had to come out, not drained, not covered with a tarp and forgotten about, not fined and left alone. Out. Gone. Demolished. I read it twice standing at the mailbox. Then I went inside and read it a third time at the kitchen table. This time slower, the way you read something when you're hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic on the second pass. They didn't. Here's what you need to understand about my situation. I didn't build that pool. I didn't commission it, design it, or sign off on any contractor. I bought this house 3 years earlier, and the pool was already there, had been there for over a decade, according to the neighbors who'd watched the whole street evolve from raw lots to finished homes. The previous owners had put it in sometime in the early 2000s. It was part of the property when I toured it, part of the reason I bought it, honestly. My kids were 6 and 9 at the time. A backyard pool felt like one of those purchases that solves a category of summer problems all at once. No red flags during the inspection. The inspector documented the pool, noted its condition, moved on. No flags at closing. The title company processed everything. My lender appraised the property with the pool as a feature, not a liability. 3 years of summers. 3 years of the HOA sending the usual letters about lawn height and holiday lighting timelines, none of which mentioned the pool. And then this. The panic that followed was immediate and not particularly rational. I called my wife. I called my brother-in-law, who'd gone through an HOA dispute a few years back over a fence, though nothing remotely like this. I spent 40 minutes on the phone with a neighbor who'd gotten a similar letter years ago about an unpermitted shed. His situation resolved easily, which was not comforting because this was clearly not that situation. Then I found an attorney, a real one, not a friend of a friend who'd taken one property law class in 1997, a woman who specialized in HOA disputes and had the kind of calm, slightly detached manner that either means they've seen everything or they've stopped feeling things. I later decided it was both. Her hourly rate rearranged my priorities quickly. With the clock running, I did what she told me to do. Gather everything, HOA governing documents, the CC&Rs, the covenanters, conditions, and restrictions that every homeowner in the subdivision technically agreed to follow when they signed at closing, regardless of whether they'd read them. County permit records. The original pool permit application, if one existed. Property survey. Deed. The plat map for the subdivision. This is where the rabbit hole opened up. Because what I found, working through those documents over the following week, was not the simple story I'd been hoping for. Not a paperwork error I could get corrected. Not a previous owner's minor oversight that time had healed. What I found was a landscape of overlapping systems, legal, physical, regulatory, that had each been built independently, by different people at different times for different purposes. Systems that had never been designed to talk to each other. And underneath all of it, literally underneath, 8 feet below the surface of my backyard, something that nobody had thought to mention. The HOA's enforcement letter wasn't just an order to remove a pool. It was an order that, if carried out the standard way, by a standard contractor following standard demolition protocol, would destroy the HOA's own underground drainage infrastructure. Nobody knew that yet. Not me, not my attorney, not the HOA board. But the ground knew. Most people, when they picture their neighborhood, picture what they can see. The houses, the driveways, the mailboxes lined up at the curb, the lawns that look better on some blocks than others, the stop signs, the street lights, the occasional speed bump that everyone complains about at the annual meeting. What they don't picture is what's underneath all of it. Because underneath all of it, beneath the asphalt, beneath the topsoil, beneath the carefully landscaped backyards and the concrete patios and the garden beds, there is another neighborhood entirely. One that was built first, before any house went up, before any family moved in. A neighborhood of pipes and culverts and French drains and underground channels, engineered specifically to handle the one thing that suburban development creates in enormous quantities: water. Not drinking water, storm water. The rain that falls on hundreds of rooftops and driveways and lawns and has nowhere natural to go anymore, because what used to be open land, land that absorbed rainfall slowly, distributed it through root systems, let it percolate down into aquifers, is now sealed under concrete and asphalt and sod. That water doesn't disappear. It runs. And in a subdivision of 200 or 500 or 1,000 homes, it runs fast and it runs in volume. Someone has to manage where it goes. That someone in almost every master-planned community built in the United States over the last 70 years is a system of underground infrastructure that most homeowners will never see, never think about, and never know exists until something goes wrong. The story of how that infrastructure got there and who became responsible for it runs directly through one piece of federal legislation. Before 1972, stormwater management in American suburbs was, to put it charitably, improvised. Developers did what local governments required, which was often not very much. Water ran to the lowest point. Ditches were dug. Pipes were laid where they seemed necessary. Nobody was particularly rigorous about long-term maintenance planning, because long-term maintenance was someone else's problem once the development sold out. The 1972 Clean Water Act changed the framework. For the first time, there was federal language around what could and couldn't flow into American waterways. And stormwater, carrying with it whatever it picked up running across rooftops and streets and lawns, was increasingly recognized as a significant source of the contamination the act was trying to address. The EPA followed up with something called NPDES permits, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Phase 1 came in the late 1980s and early 1990s, targeting large municipalities. Phase 2, in the late 1990s, reached smaller cities and towns. Suddenly, local governments that had never thought hard about subdivision drainage were required to demonstrate that new developments met stormwater quality standards. Developers responded the way developers always respond to new regulatory requirements. They built the infrastructure necessary to satisfy the rules and then structured the handoff so that long-term maintenance became someone else's problem. That someone else was the HOA, the Homeowners Association, the organization that would eventually send letters about lawn height and holiday lighting and, in my case, pool demolition, became the legal steward of underground stormwater infrastructure that engineers had designed, developers had built, and municipalities had approved. The pipes went in. The plats got recorded. The drainage easements got written into the deeds. And the HOA inherited responsibility for a network that ran, in many cases, directly beneath the private lots of the homeowners it also governed. That word, easement, is doing a lot of work here, and it's worth understanding exactly what it means. An easement is not ownership. The HOA doesn't own the strip of your backyard where their drainage pipe runs. You own it. It's on your deed, it's in your lot survey, it's part of the property you pay taxes on, but an easement is a right. A perpetual, recorded, legally enforceable right that says, within this defined area of your property, this other party, the HOA, in this case, has the right to access, maintain, repair, and protect their infrastructure. Your ownership doesn't override that right. Your improvements don't override that right. What you build above that easement exists at the tolerance of whoever holds it. It's written into your deed, usually in the kind of language that assumes you have a real estate attorney on retainer and infinite patience for subordinate clauses. Somewhere around page 9, in a paragraph that begins with subject to all easements, restrictions, and encumbrances of record. The phrase that every buyer skims because it sounds like boilerplate and turns out, sometimes, to be the most consequential sentence in the entire document. Most homeowners have no idea it's there, not because anyone hid it, because daily life doesn't require you to know it. You mow the lawn over it, you plant flower beds above it, you pour a concrete patio across it. None of those things trigger a problem, so the easement stays invisible, doing nothing, until the moment it does everything. In my case, that moment came with an excavator and a demolition order. But before I get to that, before any equipment touched any concrete, I needed to understand exactly what was sitting underneath my backyard. What I found changed the entire shape of the problem. My attorney had a habit of delivering bad news the way a doctor delivers a difficult diagnosis. Calmly, Precisely. Without the cushioning language that most people use when they're about to say something you don't want to hear. She pulled up the county plat records on her screen, turned it toward me, and pointed. There, she said. That dashed line, running across the lower right corner of your lot at roughly a 43-degree angle. That's a drainage easement. And that she moved her finger slightly, is where the HOA's main storm water line runs. I looked at the drawing. My lot was a neat rectangle on the plat. The dashed line entered from the rear property boundary, crossed diagonally through what was now my backyard, and exited toward the neighboring lot. According to the as-built notes, the engineers documented measurements from original construction. The pipe sat approximately 8 feet below grade. 8 feet. Directly along the eastern edge of my pool structure. Not beneath the pool. Not through it. But close enough that the relationship between the two, the concrete shell and the buried pipe, was not incidental. They had been coexisting in the same soil environment for over 15 years. The pool had been built first. The pipe had been there decades before that. And somewhere in that timeline, the ground had quietly organized itself around both of them as permanent features. The previous owners had commissioned the pool in the early 2000s. They'd hired a contractor. They pulled a municipal building permit. I found it in the county records, signed and stamped, inspections passed. What they hadn't done, because nobody required it and nobody told them to, was apply for HOA Architectural Committee approval. And what neither they nor their contractor had done was commission a private utility survey that would have included the HOA's drainage easement. They called 811 before breaking ground. Standard practice. The public utility lines got marked. Nobody marked the HOA pipe because the HOA pipe wasn't in the 811 system. The contractor dug, built, and finished. The pool passed its municipal inspections. The family swam in it for years. The house sold, then sold again. Then I bought it. 15 years of nobody noticing. This kind of retroactive non-compliance is more common than most people realize, particularly in the Sun Belt states. Arizona, California, Florida, Texas, where pool construction boomed through the late 1990s and early 2000s. The combination of hot climate, suburban growth, and relatively affordable pool installation created a wave of backyard construction that outpaced the administrative machinery meant to regulate it. HOA architectural review processes were often slow, inconsistently enforced, and, in communities where the board turned over frequently, poorly documented. Contractors knew that municipal permits were legally required and that HOA approval was technically required, but that the consequences of skipping the HOA step were unlikely to materialize quickly, so some skipped it. Homeowners didn't always know the difference between municipal approval and HOA approval, or didn't know both were required. The result was a generation of improvements. Pools, additions, outbuildings, extended driveways that existed in a kind of administrative limbo. Permitted by the city, unauthorized by the HOA, grandfathered through multiple ownership cycles, invisible as violations until a new board member reviewed old records, or a neighbor filed a complaint, or an HOA management company conducted an audit. That's what happened in my neighborhood. A routine compliance audit. Someone cross-referenced the satellite imagery against the architectural approval records and found pools that had no corresponding approval on file. Letters went out across the subdivision. Mine was one of them. The HOA's enforcement action wasn't malicious. The pool genuinely lacked the required approval. The board was doing what HOA boards are supposed to do, enforcing the governing documents consistently and on the record. What they hadn't done, what the letter didn't reflect, what the enforcement process hadn't accounted for, was look at what was underneath. Nobody had asked what removing that pool would actually do to the ground it had been sitting in for 15 years. Nobody had pulled the drainage easement drawing and measured the distance between the pool wall and the pipe. Nobody had asked a geotechnical engineer whether the relationship between that concrete shell and that buried infrastructure created a removal risk that the standard demolition protocol wasn't designed to handle. The order to demolish had been issued as if the pool existed in isolation. It didn't. Most people picture pool demolition as a straightforward subtraction. Pool exists. Excavator arrives. Concrete breaks. Debris hauls away. Hole fills. Ground levels. Done. It's a reasonable picture. It's also almost entirely wrong. or at least dangerously incomplete in ways that only become visible after something has already gone wrong underground. Here's what actually happens. And to understand it properly, you have to stop thinking about the pool as a thing sitting on top of the ground and start thinking about it as a thing that has become part of the ground. An in-ground concrete pool shell is not a passive object. From the moment it's poured and cured, it begins a relationship with the soil surrounding it. The earth pushes inward from all sides, lateral pressure from the surrounding soil mass, vertical pressure from the weight of everything above. The pool shell, rigid and reinforced, pushes back. An equilibrium develops. The soil compacts around the shell. The pressure distribution across the surrounding earth stabilizes with the pool as a fixed, permanent reference point. Geotechnical engineers, the specialists who study how soil behaves under load, have a term for objects that function this way in the ground. They call them soil nails, or load distributors. The pool isn't just sitting in the earth. It's become structurally integrated with it, whether anyone intended that or not. Now consider what sits 8 feet below that pool. An aging stormwater pipe. In older subdivisions, often concrete, clay tile, or cast iron, that has been settling into its own equilibrium for decades. These pipes were designed to handle vertical loads from above, the weight of soil, the weight of vehicles passing on nearby streets, the hydrostatic pressure of the water flowing through them. They were not designed to handle sudden, dramatic changes in the load distribution of the soil around them, but for 15 years they haven't had to, because the pool shell above them has been doing something nobody asked it to do, distributing the surface loads in a way that protected the pipe below. The weight of the concrete decking, the soil backfilled around the shell, even the water in the pool itself, all of it has been spreading across the rigid shell and transferring to the surrounding earth in a pattern that the pipe joints below have settled into and accommodated. The pipe doesn't know the pool is there, but the soil does, and the soil has organized itself accordingly. Then the excavator arrives. The operator starts at the edge of the pool deck, breaking the surrounding concrete first. The jackhammer vibrations travel through the soil, the first disruption to an equilibrium that's been stable for 15 years. Then the excavator bucket starts pulling up the pool shell itself, breaking it in sections, loading the pieces into dump trucks. As each section of shell comes out, something changes in the soil. The lateral pressure that the shell was resisting, the inward push of the surrounding earth, suddenly has nothing to push against. The soil begins to move. Not dramatically, not immediately, not in a way you'd necessarily notice from the surface, but at the microscopic level of grain-to-grain contact, the soil is reorganizing. Compaction zones shift. Voids open where the concrete was. The load distribution that the system had built around the pool's presence begins to dissolve. 8 feet down, the pipe feels this. Not all at once. Settlement is rarely dramatic in the early stages. What happens first is differential settlement. The pipe experiences different rates of movement at different points along its length. The section closest to the excavation settles slightly faster than the section further away. The joint between those two sections, designed to handle minor movement, not the kind of sudden reorganization triggered by removing a major load-bearing element from the overlying soil, begins to experience shear stress it was never rated for. Old pipe joints are not forgiving. A concrete pipe joint from the 1980s, after 4 decades of minor thermal expansion and contraction, after years of tree root intrusion and soil chemistry working on the mortar, after the slow micro-movements that all buried infrastructure experiences, that joint is holding on. It is not holding on with significant margin. Shear stress from differential settlement is exactly the kind of force that finds that margin and exceeds it. The joint cracks, sometimes partially, a hairline that allows infiltration and begins a slow failure. Sometimes completely, a full shear break that separates 2 pipe sections and creates an immediate structural failure in the drainage line. In the worst cases, the failure doesn't stop at one joint. The disrupted soil zone propagates. Adjacent sections of pipe, now also experiencing changed load distribution, begin their own settlement process. The failure moves along the pipe run like a slow collapse, each section losing support as the soil reorganization triggered by the demolition works its way outward. Here is the part that makes this genuinely difficult to accept. The excavator operator did nothing wrong. He broke the pool where you break a pool. He pulled the debris where you pulled debris. He backfilled according to the specifications, compacted lifts, proper density, correct sequencing. Standard demolition protocol. Executed correctly. And somewhere 8 feet below, a pipe that had been functioning without incident since the Carter administration quietly failed. Not because anyone was careless, not because anyone skipped a step, because the standard demolition protocol was designed without accounting for what happens when a concrete pool shell has spent 15 years becoming a structural participant in the soil environment around an aging stormwater pipe. The protocol assumed the pool was just a pool. The ground knew differently, and the ground, as it always does, eventually said so. The first thing my attorney said when I described the situation, the pipe, the easement, the demolition order, the proximity, was not, "How unusual." It was not, "I've never seen this before." It was, "Which state are you in?" That question told me everything, because the answer mattered not because the laws were dramatically different, but because she already knew the geography of this problem. She knew which states had seen enough of these cases to have developing case law around them. She knew which soil conditions amplified the risk. She knew which HOA structures were most likely to issue enforcement orders without pre-demolition engineering review. This wasn't a novel scenario she was encountering for the first time. It was a pattern she recognized immediately, and the pattern had a geography: Arizona, California, Florida, Texas. These 4 states account for a disproportionate share of pool demolition-related drainage failures in the United States, and the reasons are not complicated once you understand them. First, pools. The Sunbelt climate made in-ground pools a standard backyard feature in a way that northern states never experienced. Pool construction boomed through the 1990s and accelerated through the early 2000s. Hundreds of thousands of in-ground pools went in across master plan subdivisions, where HOA governing documents required architectural approval, where drainage easements crossed rear lots, and where the administrative machinery of approval and documentation couldn't keep pace with the volume of construction happening around it. Second, soil. Arizona and Texas have expansive clay soils, the kind that swell when wet and contract when dry, creating chronic movement in buried infrastructure that slowly weakens joints and seals over decades. California has a mix of expansive soils and seismic activity that compounds settlement risk. Florida has high water tables and sandy soils that respond dramatically to changes in the subsurface load environment. All 4 soil types amplify the consequences of pool demolition near shallow drainage infrastructure. Third, HOA density. These states have some of the highest concentrations of HOA-governed communities in the country. More HOAs means more enforcement activity. More enforcement activity means more demolition orders. More demolition orders issued without subsurface review means more opportunities for exactly this kind of failure. The pattern isn't a coincidence. It's a logical outcome of those 3 factors converging in the same geography. The financial exposure when a drainage system fails is not the kind of number that stays abstract for long. Drainage pipe collapse repairs average between $50,000 and $250,000 depending on several variables: how deep the pipe runs, what diameter it is, how many linear feet have failed, and whether the failure has propagated to adjacent sections or remained localized. In older subdivisions with aging infrastructure, propagation is common. A failure at one joint creates changed load conditions for neighboring joints. Those joints, already weakened by decades of micro-movement and material degradation, develop their own cracks. The collapse moves. By the time the investigation is complete and the repair scope is defined, the number has often grown well beyond the initial estimate. And that number doesn't disappear. It lands on the HOA's balance sheet, which means it lands on every homeowner in the community through one of 2 mechanisms: a special assessment, a one-time charge levied against all members, or increased monthly dues spread over a longer period. Either way, people who had nothing to do with the pool, the enforcement action, the demolition, or the pipe failure are writing checks because of all 3. That tends to produce community meetings, the kind where the folding chairs fill up faster than usual, and the board members sit at the front table with the particular expression of people who would rather be anywhere else. But here's what those meetings almost never surface clearly. The anger in the room is usually directed at the homeowner, the one with the pool, the one whose demolition apparently broke something. That narrative is simple, it's visible, and it's emotionally satisfying in the way that having a clear target always is. What doesn't get said clearly, what the board members themselves often don't fully understand yet, is that the failure didn't begin with the excavator. It began with the enforcement letter. It began the moment an HOA board issued a demolition order without pulling the drainage easement drawing, without commissioning a utility survey, without asking a civil engineer whether the removal they were mandating could damage the infrastructure they were legally obligated to protect. The homeowner's excavator broke the pipe, but the board's letter set the excavator in motion. That distinction, invisible in the folding chair meeting, contested in the litigation that follows, is where the real story lives. And it's a story that's playing out in subdivisions across 4 states with enough regularity that attorneys like mine answer the question, which state are you in, before they've heard anything else. Stop for a moment, because everything so far has been told from one angle, the homeowner's angle. The person who got the letter hired the attorney, discovered the easement, watched the ground shift under a demolition order they didn't ask for and couldn't refuse. That angle is real. That experience is valid. But pull the camera back further, and a different picture comes into focus. One that's less comfortable and more honest. The HOA didn't set this trap deliberately. They walked into it the same way the homeowner did, through a system that was never designed to prevent it. Go back to the beginning, not the Tuesday letter. Further back to the developer. Somewhere in the late 1970s or early 1980s, a development company bought a tract of land, hired a civil engineering firm, and designed a subdivision. The engineers did their job carefully. They calculated drainage requirements, designed a stormwater network, routed the pipes to achieve the necessary gradient and basin capacity. They filed the plat, they recorded the easements. They built the infrastructure. And then they sold the lots, handed the HOA documents to the first board of homeowners, and left. What they didn't leave behind, or what they left in a form that was never designed to survive 40 years of organizational turnover, was a comprehensive, accessible, maintainable record of exactly what they built and where. The as-built drawings existed. They were filed somewhere. A county records office, a property management company's cabinet, the original developer's archive, which may or may not still exist as a functioning entity. But there was no protocol. No requirement that the HOA maintain current, digitized, accessible documentation of the underground infrastructure they just inherited responsibility for. No mandate that said, every 5 years, verify your records against ground truth. Every time a property changes hands, ensure the new owner understands the easements that cross their lot. Every time an enforcement action involves subsurface work, consult the as-built drawings before issuing the order. Those protocols didn't exist because nobody anticipated needing them. The developers built something meant to last indefinitely and assumed the documentation would last with it. It didn't, not reliably. Not across 40 years, and multiple property management companies and volunteer board turnovers and filing system migrations. The knowledge faded, quietly, completely, until it was needed. Now add the 811 problem. When most people think about utility location, the system that prevents contractors from digging into gas lines and power cables, they think of a seamless safety net. Call the number. Wait 48 hours, the lines get marked. You dig safely. That safety net has a hole in it, a significant one. 811 marks public utilities, the infrastructure owned and maintained by municipalities, gas companies, electric utilities, telecommunications providers. These are the entities that have registered their lines in the centralized databases that 811 draws from. Private HOA drainage infrastructure is not in those databases. It's not a public utility. It's privately owned and maintained by the association. No registration requirement exists. No mandate that HOAs submit their as-built drawings to any centralized locating system. So the demolition contractor, a professional, licensed, experienced operator, calls 811 2 days before the job. He waits the required period. The locators come out and mark the area. Orange paint for telecommunications, yellow for gas, blue for water, red for electric. No markings near the pool area. The contractor looks at the clear ground, confirms his pre-dig checklist, and starts breaking concrete. The HOA drainage pipe is 8 feet down in a 5-foot wide easement that crosses the rear of the lot at a 43-degree angle, recorded in a plat document that hasn't been physically accessed since the Obama administration. It is invisible to every system the contractor consulted. It is invisible to every requirement he fulfilled. He hid it not because he was careless. He hid it because the gap between the public utility location system and the private drainage easement documentation system is wide enough to fit an excavator bucket through. Here is the perspective shift. The HOA board members who signed that enforcement letter, volunteers, remember, people who ran for a community governance position because they cared about where they lived, did not know about the geotechnical relationship between the pool shell and the drainage pipe. They did not have the engineering background to anticipate differential settlement. They did not have ready access to the 1981 as-built drawings that would have shown the pipe's proximity to the pool. They knew the pool was non-compliant. They issued the enforcement action that their governing documents required them to issue. They followed the process, and the process had a gap in it that nobody had ever filled, because nobody had ever needed to fill it until the moment the excavator arrived. That's not a defense of inadequate due diligence. When the litigation comes, and it usually comes, courts in California and Florida are increasingly willing to hold HOA boards to a reasonable care standard that includes knowing what's under the ground before ordering someone to disturb it. But it is a reframing of where the fault actually lives, not in malice, not in negligence of the obvious kind, in the accumulated gaps of a system that was built in pieces by different people at different times for different purposes, and that was never audited for the places where those pieces didn't connect. The homeowner didn't build that gap. The HOA didn't build that gap. The HOA didn't build that gap. The gap built itself slowly over 40 years, while everyone was busy with other things. And it waited, patient and invisible, for someone to send a letter on a Tuesday. At some point in every situation like this, someone says the word lawsuit. Sometimes it's the homeowner's attorney. Sometimes it's the HOA's property manager, quietly, in a phone call to their insurance carrier. Sometimes it's a neighbor who flooded, standing in their backyard looking at water that came from somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Whoever says it first, the word lands the same way. Heavy. Final. Like a door closing on the version of events where this gets resolved with a few phone calls and a handshake. Then everyone starts trying to figure out the same thing. Who actually pays for this? The answer depends enormously on where you live. Not in a minor technical sense. In a fundamental, which philosophy of property ownership does your state subscribe to sense? California and Florida have trended toward holding HOAs to a reasonable care standard before ordering invasive enforcement actions. The reasoning is grounded in the HOA's dual role. They are both the enforcement authority and the infrastructure steward. They have or should have access to the original plat documents. They have or should have records of the drainage easements crossing private lots. If they knew, or reasonably should have known, that a drainage easement ran near the pool they were ordering demolished, and they failed to require a pre-demolition engineering assessment, then the damage that followed is at least partially their responsibility. The legal term is comparative negligence. The HOA's failure to exercise reasonable care before issuing the order contributes to the outcome. Texas and Arizona lean differently. The default position places responsibility for consequences of work performed on private property with the property owner, absent specific CC&R language shifting that burden. The HOA issued an order. The homeowner executed work on their own land. What happened beneath that land is the homeowner's problem until a court decides otherwise. Neither position is irrational. They reflect genuinely different views of what property ownership means. But for the homeowner caught between them, the difference can be measured in 6 figures. The middle ground generating the most litigation involves a doctrine called estoppel. Estoppel, in its simplest form, prevents a party from taking a position that contradicts their previous actions when another party has reasonably relied on those actions. Applied here, the HOA issued a demolition order. The homeowner, acting in good faith, complied. They hired a contractor, followed standard protocol, completed the work the HOA required. If the HOA's order, issued without adequate subsurface review, created the conditions for the pipe failure, can they then hold the homeowner financially responsible for following their instruction? In a growing number of cases, courts have said, not entirely. The homeowner relied on the HOA's authority. The HOA exercised that authority without the due diligence their stewardship role required. The HOA's attorneys argue otherwise. Their CC&Rs typically contain indemnity clauses holding lot owners responsible for damage traceable to their improvements and contractors. The pool was unauthorized. The demolition was work performed on the homeowner's lot. The damage, the indemnity clause argues, is theirs. Whether that indemnity clause survives an estoppel argument depends on the specific governing document language, the specific pre-demolition facts, and the specific judge on the case, which is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. What accumulating case law is slowly producing is pressure, not uniform rules, not clean answers. Pressure on HOA boards, on property management companies, on attorneys advising them to document more carefully before enforcement actions involving subsurface work, to pull the drainage easement drawings before the letter goes out, to require a utility survey as a condition of the demolition order. Because the case law is making one thing increasingly clear: board members who signed the enforcement letter are not automatically protected by the fact that they were following their governing documents. If following those documents meant ordering invasive work without adequate subsurface investigation, then following the documents was itself the negligent act. Then there's the insurance question. HOA master policies typically cover infrastructure damage. A pipe collapses, insurance pays. That's the expectation. Except many policies contain a clause excluding damage arising from enforcement-related activities where the association failed to exercise adequate due diligence. The insurer's reasoning is coldly logical. If the HOA created the conditions for the damage through inadequate pre-enforcement investigation, paying from the insurance pool would subsidize institutional carelessness. So the repair cost doesn't go to the insurance carrier. It goes to the special assessment, to every homeowner in the community, and potentially to the board members personally, not for corruption, not for self-dealing, but for the ordinary institutional failure of issuing an order without fully understanding what that order would do. Nothing clarifies due diligence requirements quite like watching the previous board write personal checks. Here is something that almost nobody outside the geotechnical engineering world knows, and when you hear it, your first instinct will be to reject it, because it contradicts everything that feels intuitively correct about doing a job properly, about being responsible, about finishing what you started. But stay with it, because the engineering doesn't care about intuition. When a pool is removed, there are two broad approaches. The first is full removal. Complete excavation of the concrete shell, hauling away all debris, backfilling the void in compacted 8 to 12-inch lifts, achieving 95% soil density. Clean. Complete. The hole disappears. The surface levels out. From above, it looks like the pool was never there. This is what most local building codes require. This is what most HOA demolition specifications demand. This is what most homeowners, when given the choice, instinctively prefer. It feels definitive, final, responsible. The second approach is partial abandonment. You drain the pool completely. You perforate the floor, drill holes through the concrete bottom to allow groundwater drainage and prevent future hydrostatic uplift. You fill the interior partially with gravel and compacted soil. You cap the top. The shell remains in the ground, invisible from the surface, structurally present below it. Most people, hearing these two options described, pick full removal without hesitation. Of course, you remove it completely. Leaving concrete in the ground sounds like cutting corners, like the cheaper option dressed up as a legitimate choice. Here is what the geotechnical engineers found, particularly in regions with high water tables and sandy or loosely structured soils. In certain conditions, partial abandonment protects shallow drainage pipes better than full removal. The reason comes back to everything we already know about how pool shells interact with surrounding soil. The shell is a rigid structural element. It distributes load. The soil around it has organized itself around its presence. The pipe below exists in a soil environment that has accounted for the shell as a permanent feature. With partial abandonment, the shell stays. It continues distributing load. The pipe below continues experiencing the same soil environment it has always experienced. The equilibrium is preserved. No differential settlement. No void and collapse cycle. The pipe doesn't know anything changed. With full removal, the shell disappears. The load distribution environment that the pipe has been living in for 15 years dissolves. Settlement begins. The process we already walked through, differential movement, joint stress, shear cracking, starts its slow work. The counterintuitive reality, the less complete solution is sometimes the more protective one. Not because it's cheaper or easier, because the ground doesn't respond to visual tidiness. It responds to load distribution. And sometimes the concrete you leave behind is doing more structural work than the compacted soil you replace it with. High water table regions add another dimension entirely. In Florida, coastal California, and along the Gulf Coast, the water table can sit just a few feet below grade. When full excavation proceeds in these conditions, removing the pool shell disturbs the hydrostatic balance of the surrounding soil. Water pressure from below, no longer counterbalanced by the weight and rigidity of the shell, pushes upward through the excavation zone. In significant cases, this produces soil liquefaction, where saturated soil temporarily loses its structural integrity and behaves more like a dense fluid than a solid. In that environment, a shallow stormwater pipe doesn't just settle, it can physically shift position. Joints fail. Alignment changes. When the soil resolidifies, the pipe is somewhere it was never designed to be. Many jurisdictions moved away from partial abandonment after 2020, driven by legitimate concerns about long-term subsidence and insurance complications. Regulatory momentum pushed toward full removal as the standard. But in that policy shift, a quiet engineering reality got buried alongside the concrete shells. The soil doesn't care what the policy says, it cares about load. And the pipe 8 feet down, experiencing hydrostatic uplift during a full excavation in a high water table environment, doesn't care that full removal was the regulation-compliant choice. It just fails. You've seen the signs on construction sites. The spray-painted lines on pavement before a road crew shows up, different colors marking different things beneath the surface. Orange for telecommunications, yellow for gas, blue for water, red for electric, green for sewer. The system behind those lines is called 811, the number you call before you dig anything. 48 hours notice, minimum. Locators come out, mark the area, clear you for excavation. It exists because hitting a gas line with an excavator bucket is catastrophic. Hitting a power cable is potentially fatal. The 811 system has been standardized nationally since the 1990s and has, without question, saved lives and prevented disasters on a significant scale. It is also, for our purposes, completely insufficient. 81111 marks public utilities. The infrastructure owned and maintained by municipalities, gas companies, electric utilities, telecommunications providers. These entities have registered their lines in the centralized databases that 811 locators draw from. Registration is required. The system works because participation is mandatory for public utility operators. Private HOA drainage infrastructure is not a public utility. It is privately owned, privately maintained, and privately documented. Or not documented, as the case increasingly turns out to be. No registration requirement exists. No mandate that HOAs submit their as-built drawings to any centralized locating system. No mechanism by which a contractor calling 811 would ever learn that a private drainage easement crosses the rear of the lot he's about to excavate. The gap is not a flaw in the 811 system. The 811 system was designed for public utilities and works exactly as designed. The gap is between that system and the parallel universe of private easement documentation that HOAs maintain or fail to maintain independently. Picture the demolition contractor on the morning of the job. He's licensed. He's experienced. He's done dozens of pool demolitions. He called 811 2 days ago, waited the required period, watched the locators come out and mark the area. He's reviewed the markings. No paint near the pool structure. Ground is clear. He runs through his pre-excavation checklist. Everything is documented. Everything is compliant. He gives the signal and the excavator starts moving. 8 feet below the surface, in a 5-foot wide easement recorded on a 1981 plat drawing that hasn't been physically accessed in over a decade, the HOA's main drainage line runs directly along the eastern edge of the pool structure. It is invisible to every system the contractor consulted. It does not appear in the 811 database. It does not appear on any municipal utility map. It exists only in the HOA's records. Records that, in this case, are paper drawings in a filing cabinet at a property management office that nobody thought to contact before the demolition order was issued. The contractor hits the pipe not because he skipped a step. He hits it because the step that would have prevented it doesn't exist in any checklist he's required to follow. This is the gap that progressive HOA attorneys and forward-thinking building departments are now trying to close. The emerging standard, not yet uniform, not yet required everywhere, but growing in adoption, is what some practitioners are calling the pre-demolition package. 3 components all required before any equipment arrives on site. First, HOA as-built drawings, current and verified, showing all drainage easements within a defined radius of the proposed excavation. Not 40-year-old paper copies retrieved from a filing cabinet the week before. Digitized, confirmed against ground truth, signed by the HOA's engineer of record. Second, a private utility locate report commissioned separately from 811 conducted by a locating service with ground-penetrating radar capability and specific instruction to identify private easement infrastructure. Not a replacement for 811, an addition to it, covering the category that 811 structurally cannot reach. Third, a licensed civil engineer's written sign-off on the demolition plan, confirming that the proposed excavation sequence, equipment restrictions, and backfill specifications adequately protect any drainage infrastructure within the impact zone. 3 documents. Free professionals. A few weeks of additional process before the excavator arrives. In communities where this package has been adopted as a permit condition, drainage failures during pool demolition have dropped significantly. Not to zero. Nothing goes to zero in civil engineering, but significantly. In communities where it hasn't been adopted, the pattern continues. The 811 call gets made. The ground gets marked for public utilities. The private easement stays invisible. The excavator arrives. And the gap does what gaps always do when something moves through them. Put yourself in a different room for a moment. Not a courtroom. Not a backyard with an excavator. Not a folding chair community meeting where everyone is angry and nobody has clean hands. A drafting room. Sometime in 1981. Fluorescent lights, large format paper on an angled table, pencils and rulers, and a set of engineers' triangles lined up at the edge of the board. A man. We don't know his name. It doesn't appear in any of the documents that survived. Is drawing the drainage network for a subdivision that doesn't exist yet. The lots are blank rectangles on his drawing. No houses. No driveways. No backyard pools because nobody has moved in yet, and nobody will for another 2 years when the first phase sells out. Just the infrastructure layer. The pipes, the culverts, the drainage basins, the easement corridors. He's thinking about flow rates, about gradient, the precise slope required to keep water moving through the pipe without silting, about basin capacity during a 100-year storm event, about the downstream connection to the municipal system 3 blocks away. He's doing his job carefully, competently, with the tools and the knowledge and the regulatory requirements of 1981. He has no idea that in 20 years, a family will install an in-ground pool on Lot 47. He has no idea that the pool will sit 11 feet from the pipe he's drawing right now. He has no idea that in 40 years, a homeowners association will send a letter ordering that pool demolished. He has no idea that the demolition will disturb the soil environment his pipe has been sitting in for 4 decades, or that the joint at the 40-foot mark will shear under differential settlement forces that nobody in 1981 was required to anticipate. He draws the line. He moves to the next lot. He hands the completed drawings to the developer. The developer files them with the county. The county archives them. The HOA inherits responsibility for the infrastructure without inheriting a living, maintained, accessible version of the knowledge that describes it. This is not a story about negligence. It's a story about time. About the way technical knowledge degrades when the people who hold it move on and the systems meant to preserve it weren't built for the duration they're asked to cover. The engineer retired, or changed firms, or died. The developer dissolved the project entity and moved to the next subdivision. The county archived the drawings in a format that required physical access to retrieve. The HOA cycled through board members and property management companies, each transition losing a little more institutional memory than the last. The drawing survived. Paper is durable, but the living understanding of what the drawing meant, what it implied for anyone who would ever disturb the ground above that pipe, that understanding didn't survive the same way, until the excavator arrived and the ground provided its own explanation. The 1981 engineer built something meant to outlast him. It did. What didn't outlast him was the context that would have prevented someone, 40 years later, from destroying it by accident while trying to follow the rules. That's not a gap anyone designed. It's a gap that time built, 1 year at a time, while everyone was busy with other things. There is a particular kind of document that only surfaces when lawyers get involved. Not because anyone was hiding it, because nobody knew to look for it, because the question it answers, who knew what and when, only becomes urgent after something has already gone wrong and the financial consequences need to be allocated somewhere. Litigation has a way of finding these documents. Subpoenas reach into filing cabinets that haven't been opened in years. Discovery requests pull county archive boxes that were last accessed when the records were filed. Property management companies produce folders that nobody on the current HOA board knew existed. And what comes out, in case after case involving pool demolition and drainage failure, is a paper trail that reframes everything. Original plat maps surface first. The actual subdivision drawings from the original developer's engineer. Not photocopies, not digital scans, but the physical documents that were filed when the community was platted. These drawings show, with precision, exactly where every drainage easement runs, exactly which lots they cross, exactly how close they come to the areas where pools were later installed. These documents were always public record. They were always available. They were sitting in the county records office the entire time, accessible to anyone who knew to ask for them. Nobody asked. Not the homeowner who built the pool. Not the contractor who demolished it. Not the HOA board that issued the order. Next come the HOA Morton that issued the order. Next come the HOA meeting minutes. This is where litigation occasionally produces something that changes the entire trajectory of a case. Board meeting minutes from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, sometimes 15, where someone raised a concern. A board member who noticed the pool during a neighborhood walk. A property manager who flagged the proximity of a drainage easement to an unpermitted structure. A homeowner who wrote a letter that got read into the record and then filed and forgotten. Somebody knew, or somebody almost knew, or somebody had enough information that a reasonable person would have investigated further and didn't. That minute, that letter, that flagged concern in litigation, it becomes evidence of constructive knowledge. The HOA can no longer argue they had no reason to investigate the subsurface impact of their demolition order. The record shows the issue was proximate to their awareness, even if it never fully crystallized into action. Then the insurance documents arrive. And sometimes, this is where the board members' faces change. The HOA master policy, the coverage everyone assumed would handle infrastructure repair costs, gets reviewed line by attorneys on both sides. And buried in the exclusions section, in the kind of subordinate clause language that insurance policies specialize in, is the enforcement-related damage clause. Damage arising from association enforcement actions where the board failed to exercise adequate pre-enforcement due diligence is excluded from coverage. The insurer's position is consistent and defensible. They price the policy around normal infrastructure risk, damage that the association's own conduct created, by ordering invasive work without adequate investigation, falls outside that risk profile. Paying it from the insurance pool would mean every HOA the carrier covers subsidizes this one board's failure to pull a plat map before sending a letter, so the coverage doesn't apply. The repair cost, whatever the final number is, becomes a special assessment. It becomes a line item in next year's budget. It becomes in some cases a personal liability question for the board members whose signatures appear on the enforcement letter. Volunteers. People who showed up to meetings. People who ran for a governance position because they wanted their neighborhood to be well maintained. Writing personal checks because nobody pulled the 1981 drawing before the letter went out. I want to tell you about my neighbor. Not the one next door, 3 streets over. Different cul-de-sac, different lot configuration, same subdivision, same HOA audit that generated the enforcement letters. His pool was older than mine. Built in the late 1990s, same era of unpermitted backyard construction, same administrative gap between municipal permits and HOA architectural approval. He got his letter the same week I got mine. The difference is what happened next. He didn't hire an attorney immediately. He called the HOA directly, had a conversation with the property manager, and was told the process was straightforward. Hire a licensed demolition contractor, follow the standard protocol, submit the completion documentation. The HOA sent him their standard demolition specifications, a 1-page document covering permit requirements, compaction standards, and final grading expectations. Nothing in that document mentioned drainage easements. Nothing mentioned utility surveys. Nothing mentioned the HOA's underground infrastructure or the proximity of any drainage line to his pool structure. He hired a contractor. A legitimate one, licensed, insured, experienced in pool demolitions across the area. The contractor called 811, got clearance, reviewed the one-page HOA specifications and showed up on a Monday morning with an excavator. Standard demolition, standard equipment, standard timeline. 6 weeks later, on an unremarkable Wednesday afternoon, my neighbor noticed something odd in his backyard. A slight depression in the soil near the rear property line. The kind of subtle surface change that most people would attribute to normal settling and ignore. He walked over, pressed his foot against it, and felt the ground give slightly in a way that soil compacted to 95% density shouldn't give. He called the contractor. The contractor came out, looked at it, and told him it was probably minor differential settling. Common in the weeks after demolition, nothing to worry about unless it progressed. It progressed. The rain came 5 weeks after that. 3 inches in 48 hours, the kind of storm that tests drainage systems across an entire subdivision simultaneously. Every roof, every driveway, every lawn pushing runoff into the underground network at once. The cracked pipe section, 40 feet long, shear failed at the joint closest to the former pool excavation, couldn't handle the surge volume. The crack that had been a slow infiltration problem became a full structural failure under pressure. The downstream flow backed up. The upstream pressure built. 2 drainage inlets failed simultaneously, both in backyards, both in properties that had nothing to do with any pool, any enforcement letter, any demolition. The first homeowner came home to find 8 inches of standing water against their rear foundation. The water had been there long enough to begin infiltrating the basement wall. Foundation moisture intrusion. The kind that requires professional remediation, not a wet-dry vacuum and a fan. The damage assessment came in at just over $40,000. The second homeowner lost a paver patio they'd installed the previous spring. The saturated soil beneath the pavers had shifted enough that the entire surface, 2,000 square feet of carefully laid stone, was unsalvageable. $18,000 of hardscaping, gone. Both homeowners called the HOA. The HOA called their insurance carrier. The insurance carrier sent an adjuster. The adjuster traced the failure back to the pipe. The pipe failure traced back to the demolition. The demolition traced back to the enforcement letter. And then everyone filed against everyone. The litigation ran 2.5 years. My neighbor against the HOA estoppel argument, following their specifications, no warning about drainage easements. The HOA against my neighbor, indemnity clause, work performed on his lot, his contractor's equipment. The flooded homeowners against both. The demolition contractor pulled in as a third party. The original contractor who built the pool, tracked down after 15 years, served with a joinder complaint. The settlement was sealed. But in the way that settlements in small subdivisions always leak, the rough numbers circulated within a few months. Somewhere north of $180,000, divided in proportions that left nobody satisfied and everyone feeling they'd paid for something that wasn't entirely their fault, which to be fair was probably accurate for everyone involved. The HOA levied a special assessment, $1,200 per household spread across 147 units. People who had never heard of the pool, never attended a meeting where it was discussed, never received a letter about anything except lawn maintenance and holiday lighting, writing $1,200 checks for a pipe that failed because nobody looked at a drawing from 1981. I want to be honest about something. What happened in my case didn't go right because I was smarter than my neighbor. It went right because my attorney had seen it go wrong before, and she was not willing to let the standard process run without changing it first. The demolition order was legitimate. The pool lacked HOA architectural approval, documented, real, and challenging. It was going to be expensive with uncertain odds. My attorney was clear. Comply with the order and negotiate the how. So, we negotiated the how. What she put on the table was a modified demolition protocol, not a refusal to comply, a condition of compliance. Before any equipment arrived on my property, the HOA was required to produce their as-built drainage drawings for the affected area. The actual record of what was under my backyard. The actual record of what was under my backyard. The HOA's property manager pushed back. The standard process didn't require this. No other homeowner in the audit had requested it. It was going to slow things down. My attorney's response was simple. Produce the drawings or we'll see you in court arguing about why you refused to identify your own infrastructure before ordering demolition near it. The drawings arrived 3 weeks later. 3 weeks. To find documents describing infrastructure the HOA was legally obligated to maintain and protect. They were in a filing cabinet at the property management company's office. A manila folder labeled with the original developer's name and a project number from 1981. Actual paper. Not digitized, not scanned, not accessible by any electronic means. Someone had to physically locate the folder, photocopy the drawings, and mail them. When they arrived, my attorney spread them on our conference table. The pipe was 11 feet from the eastern wall of my pool structure, running diagonally across the rear corner of my lot at 43 degrees, 8 feet below grade. Not beneath the pool, but well within what a geotechnical engineer would consider the zone of influence, the radius within which excavation creates meaningful changes in the soil load environment around buried infrastructure. We hired the engineer before the contractor. Ground-penetrating radar survey first. Physical verification that the pipe was where the 1981 drawing said it was. 1 day of fieldwork, 1 week of reporting. Then the demolition plan. Not the HOA's one-page specification sheet, but an engineered plan. Shoring along the eastern excavation wall. No vibratory equipment within 15 feet of the drainage easement. Flowable fill in the backfill zone closest to the pipe instead of conventionally compacted soil. Flowable fill sets without the compaction equipment that generates vibration and differential pressure against old pipe joints. The HOA objected to the timeline. My attorney sent a 1-paragraph letter explaining that the alternative was proceeding without engineering oversight near their drainage infrastructure, and that their documented objection to protective measures would be introduced as evidence in the litigation that followed if the pipe failed. The objection was withdrawn. The demolition took longer. It cost more. At the time, the additional expense felt significant. In retrospect, it feels like the cheapest money I ever spent. The pipe survived. Post-demolition inspection, 30 days after completion, confirmed no settlement, no joint movement, no infiltration. The drainage system serving the rear 40 households continued functioning exactly as the 1981 engineer designed it to. The difference between my outcome and my neighbors, between an intact pipe and a $180,000 settlement, was 1 document from a filing cabinet and 1 engineer hired before the excavator arrived. That's the entire margin. Here is the part that doesn't get discussed enough. The homeowners who built those original pools, the ones from the late 1990s, the ones from the early 2000s, many of them were not reckless. They weren't cutting corners in the way that word implies. They hired contractors' quarters. They went to the building department. They pulled permits. They scheduled inspections. They got signatures. They did what the system told them to do. What they didn't do, what nobody required them to do, what nobody clearly told them was a separate and equally mandatory step, was obtain HOA Architectural Committee approval in addition to the municipal building permit, because those two things lived in completely separate systems that never communicated with each other. Think about what that actually means in practice. The municipal building permit process runs through the city or county. You submit plans, pay fees, wait for approval, schedule inspections at various construction stages, receive final sign-off. The building department verifies code compliance, structural integrity, electrical safety, setback requirements from property lines. The HOA architectural review process runs through the association. You submit plans to the architectural committee, wait for their review, receive approval or modification requests, proceed once cleared. The committee verifies compliance with the CC&Rs, aesthetic standards, approved materials, design guidelines specific to the community. 2 separate processes, 2 separate approval bodies, 2 separate paper trails. And between them, nothing. No handshake. No shared database. No requirement that the building department verify HOA approval before issuing a permit. No requirement that the HOA notify the building department when an unapproved structure comes to their attention. The municipal system didn't know what the HOA had approved. The HOA didn't know what the city had permitted. They ran on parallel tracks that never intersected. And in that gap, an entire generation of improvements got built that were fully permitted by one system and completely unauthorized by the other. This is where the trap closes on the current owner. Because ownership cycles. Houses sell. Families move. The people who built the pool in 2002 are gone. The people who bought from them in 2009 are gone. The person holding the letter in 2024 is me. 3 years into ownership, No connection to any decision that created the violation, no knowledge that a violation existed. The municipal permit was in the county records. Visible, stamped, signed. The HOA violation was in the HOA's records, or rather, in the gap in their records where an approval should have existed but didn't. Neither disclosed the other. Neither system was designed to. The title search didn't catch it. The inspection didn't catch it. 3 years of HOA correspondence didn't catch it. A routine compliance audit caught it. And the person who catches the consequences is the one standing at the mailbox on a Tuesday, reading a letter about a pool they didn't build, containing an order they didn't expect, for a violation they didn't create. The trap wasn't designed. It assembled itself piece by piece through the ordinary operation of two systems that were each individually functional and collectively blind to each other. Nobody built the gap. The gap built itself, and it kept building quietly for 20 years until enough letters went out, enough demolitions happened, enough pipes failed, enough lawsuits were filed that the people running both systems finally had to acknowledge that the space between them was not empty. It was full of consequences that nobody had agreed to own. 3 protocol changes would have prevented all of this. Not revolutionary ones, not expensive ones requiring new legislation or federal oversight or industry-wide reform. Simple, achievable changes that use expertise and technology that already exist. First, before any HOA enforcement action involving subsurface work, the association must produce a current, verified utility survey of the affected area. Not 40-year-old paper drawings retrieved from a filing cabinet. Digitized, confirmed against ground truth, signed by an engineer of record. This is not a burden. It is the minimum due diligence that stewardship of underground infrastructure actually requires. Second, municipal pool demolition permits should require HOA drainage clearance as a condition of issuance. Force the two systems, the city building department and the association, to communicate before the excavator arrives. One mandatory handshake. That's all the gap needs to close it. Third, an engineered demolition plan, reviewed and stamped by a licensed civil engineer, required for any excavation within a defined distance of a recorded drainage easement. Not optional. Not best practice. A permit condition. These changes are happening, slowly, unevenly, driven by litigation rather than proactive design, which is how most infrastructure policy actually evolves. A pattern repeats often enough. The consequences become expensive enough, and eventually the people running the systems agree that prevention is cheaper than settlement. But they haven't happened everywhere. And until they do, the pattern continues. My backyard is flat now. There's a rectangle of slightly different grass where the pool used to be. You can still see the shape in certain angles of afternoon light, the way the new growth is just a shade lighter than the established lawn around it. My kids notice it sometimes. Ask about it. I tell them the story, which has the disadvantage of being complicated and the advantage of being completely true. There's a drawing framed in my office, a photocopy of a photocopy, the 1981 engineer's drainage plan for this subdivision, retrieved from a manila folder that hadn't been opened in decades. My lot is a blank rectangle on the drawing. No house. No pool. Just a dashed line entering from the rear boundary, crossing the lower right corner at 43 degrees, exiting toward the neighboring lot. That line was drawn before anyone lived here, before the neighborhood had streets or mailboxes or an HOA that could send letters, before anyone had thought about what it would mean, 40 years later, for someone to disturb the ground above it. The pipe is still there, still functioning, still draining the runoff from 40 rooftops every time it rains, moving water from one end of the subdivision to the other, the way the 1981 engineer calculated it should. It doesn't know what happened above it. It doesn't know about the letter, the attorney, the modified demolition protocol, the litigation 3 streets over. It just does its job. In the dark. Long after the people who designed it forgot it exists. That's what this was always about. Not the pool, not the letter, not the liability maze or the case law or the special assessments, just a pipe doing its job in the dark and everything that happens when the world above it finally pays attention.